What I wanted to do was to start with a little mini analysis of democracy in the Middle East and to get to a bigger set of arguments that I think are relevant for our conversation today. Um, it's interesting, and I had to kind of think through this a little bit this morning. If we look at the countries that are partial democracies in the Middle East, or at least are on their way to becoming democratic, we have three cases in the region: Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. And if we add to that Libya and Yemen, two countries where Islamists hold some degree of power, then there is a lesson that becomes more clear from these three to five examples. And it's not necessarily a lesson that I love. The lesson is this: power works, violence works. And the only guarantee of success is to have both a political party and an armed militia. Obviously, Iraq, we have several Islamist parties, both Shia and Sunni, and they all have been involved in some kind of armed resistance or rebellion at some point over the last 20 years and much longer than that, actually. And in Lebanon, we have the case of the most obvious case there of Hezbollah, which is both a political party and an armed resistance group. Syria is fascinating. I was just actually in New York last week for the UN General Assembly, some things on the sidelines. And I'm sure all of you saw how the interim president of Syria now, Ahmed Shara, everyone seems to love him. He was sort of the star of the week, as far as I could tell. He was kind of meeting with everyone. And of course, he's someone who was um, the former leader of the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria. So there is a pattern here, and you can probably make out what the pattern is. It's that if you want power, if you want success, if you want victory, depending on how we define victory, the best way to do that is through the assertion of power and force. I think that's something that we as American observers shouldn't necessarily encourage. Obviously, in those cases, it was probably the only way. These are divided countries that are post-conflict, that went through brutal civil wars. And so naturally, the people who participate in politics after a cessation of violence are going to be armed in some way. But those examples don't really apply to the rest of the Middle East, and they probably shouldn't apply to the rest of the Middle East. But I think this is one of the sad takeaways of the Arab Spring, is that the very parties that tried to participate peacefully through the parliamentary process and commit themselves to democracy, to the democratic process, were the very ones who lost out. And so the unfortunate lesson here, one that I think we should resist, is that democracy offers a false promise. And we as Americans are implicated in this, of course, because during the Arab Spring, we saw how Muslim Brotherhood and Brotherhood inspired parties were trying to work through the democratic process, and we looked at them with suspicion at best, and worse, and oftentimes it was worse than just suspicion. That's a whole different story on its own. I would say that on some level, that suspicion is both fine and understandable, because we shouldn't expect American liberals who have an inherent suspicion of mixing religion and politics to be thrilled about religious parties like the Muslim Brotherhood. I get it. I think it's something that is generally understandable. And religious parties, especially in Egypt and Tunisia, were winning elections. And there is that, if you talk to, I think, American liberals and people who are more secular minded, at some fundamental level, they're just never going to be fully comfortable with that. They don't get it. The idea of Islamic law and trying to explain Sharia to them and how it operates from a Muslim perspective is always an uphill battle. But this is where I think we have to distinguish between what Americans might like in an ideal world and the reality that we see in much of the Middle East, which is that these are religiously conservative societies where large majorities want Islam and Islamic law to play at least some central role in public life. And so I think we should be able to do two things. And then this is something that I've been saying I guess since I was a graduate student in Georgetown, and it's sort of depressing that we've had to repeat the same argument endlessly, which is we don't have to like what the Brotherhood stands for, but we should defend their right to participate in the political process because we as Americans should like that. When we see religious parties or any kind of party saying, we're going to participate in parliament, we are going to form political parties, and we are going to try to gain power peacefully through those channels, that's something that we should encourage. And it's important, again, distinguishing. You don't have to like the party. You can disagree with them on everything or some things. You can have a fundamental dislike of what they stand for, but then at the same time, defend their right to participate. And that's the kind of argument that I think is very important to make, especially now. And for me, and this is something, this is an oversimplified definition of democracy that I use, but one way I like to describe it to audiences is that democracy is the right to make the wrong choice. And I would like to think that Americans are more attuned to that now, that in some ways we get that because I don't think the Republican Party should be banned. I think the Republican Party is dangerous to this country in a number of ways, but they have a right to participate in the democratic process. And if Americans vote for them and vote for their candidates, including Donald Trump, those outcomes have to be respected. So there is a kind of interesting parallel that we can make there between the American context, or for that matter, the European context, where we see the rise of far-right parties that have in my view, abhorrent views on any number of issues. But they have the right to participate, and if they win, we have to respect that, so on and so forth. So this brings me to why the various proposals and bills to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization are not just dangerous, they're fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-American because they send a message that religiously oriented parties shouldn't engage in democracy and that even when they try to moderate, that they will be punished simply for their religious orientation. Because if we look at the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or other Muslim Brotherhood affiliates throughout the region, we do see in some ways, an impressive evolution over time. If you look at the Egyptian Brotherhood in the 1960s or early 70s, they weren't talking about democracy. They were actually uncomfortable with the word democracy. They were uncomfortable with the idea of pluralism, of secular parties, or in their view, atheistic parties participating in the political process. But in the 1980s and 90s and going through the 2000s, we see a shift where Brotherhood affiliates really make a concerted effort to get on board with the democracy train. That doesn't mean they were liberals or ever would become liberals, but we have to distinguish between participating in the democratic process and supporting democracy in that sense and being an American or Western style liberal. I'm not going to come out here and pretend that Brotherhood affiliates were becoming liberal in the way that Americans might want them to be, but I would argue they don't need to be. People have the right to be illiberal. Now, there are some exceptions where even Brotherhood-inspired parties were trying to become liberal, at least what we might call liberal in the Middle Eastern context, like Ennahda in Tunisia, which is its own story of a party that really tried to actually put its religious commitments to the side and be somewhat, quote unquote, liberal. We can debate whether or not that worked in retrospect, but it just goes to show that many of these parties really did make a concerted effort to change over time and to, quote unquote, moderate. But what's interesting here when we get to the religious character of these organizations is that it's kind of ironic to see that it's largely conservative Christians in the Republican Party who are most enthusiastic about banning what are in effect their Muslim equivalents abroad. When I saw, the Charlie Kirk Memorial and I saw the way that Christianity was weaponized for political ends, that was a weaponization of religion that I wouldn't dream of seeing from an Islamist party like Ennahda in Tunisia or the PJD in Morocco. They wouldn't do what you saw at Charlie Kirk's memorial. So in that sense, um, there are elements of the Republican Party here that are more Christianist than Islamists are Islamist in the Middle Eastern context. So you would think that folks like that who are speaking at Charlie Kirk's memorial would be more sympathetic to the idea of Islam playing a prominent role in public life abroad, but they're not. So the question is, what is really going on here? So I think some of this comes down to this is a complex discussion. There's a lot of factors, but a couple things I would highlight. Some of this comes down to anti-Muslim animus, pure and simple. That there is a sort of sense that Islam, this idea of Islam being a threat to Christianity and Christian civilization. But some of it also has to do with the fact that the Republican Party is I would say, considerably more pro-Israel than the Democratic Party is today. Actually, much more pro-Israel if we look at the polling on this. And the thing that these conservative Christians and Republicans don't like most about the Brotherhood, so, to some extent, I would say, for some people this is the case, is their anti-Israel stance. So when you have people like Ted Cruz or Marco Rubio who are extremely and unquestioningly pro-Israel, they look at groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and they see an anti-Israel party. And they're right. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is anti-Israel. And this is worth, I think, emphasizing because this is where foreign policy and domestic policy sort of collapse into one, because it is the policy of today's Republican Party to penalize and criminalize anti-Israel speech and activism, both at home and abroad. And this is where it's not really just a foreign policy issue, as Nathan sort of alluded to, and I'm sure Peter will mention this as well. There is an effort to say that there is a Muslim Brotherhood operating in the US that has its tentacles in government and in institutions. And, we saw this during the Obama administration in particular, where there were these kinds of conspiracy theories about Muslim Brotherhood figures who had senior positions in the US government, even perhaps the fact that Barack Obama himself was a closet Muslim Brotherhood member. And we do know, of course, that a majority of Republicans, according to various polls, did see Barack Obama as a Muslim. They actually believed that one of the polls I was looking at, just to refresh my memory, they asked if respondents believed that Obama was a Muslim deep down. And a clear majority of Republicans said yes, they believed that. So I think that this is at the heart of it, a way to kind of weaponize a potential designation of the Muslim Brotherhood abroad to use against Muslims and Muslim institutions here in America. Because I think at some level, we have to just be honest about this. All of us know people who are sort of Muslim Brotherhood influenced in the American Muslim community. They aren't a majority, but they are there. And so it's easy to kind of do this guilt by association and say, oh, this person was sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1960s or 70s when they first came to the US and set up Muslim organizations. This person knows this person who knows that person. So that's what I think is really frightening about this, a way to kind of have to cast the entire Muslim community under doubt because of these very vague affiliations. And going back to what Nathan said, because it's not really as much an organization as an idea. Fundamentally, the Muslim Brotherhood is an idea. So it becomes very easy to accuse anyone of being Muslim Brotherhood based on their ideological orientation, even if they don't have any explicit ties to a so-called Muslim Brotherhood organization. So I think that's really what we have to be aware of. That's really what's at the heart of this. And that's why it's really important, among many other reasons, to resist these efforts to designate the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.